This is a problematic statement, what is Agile? So Agile, in its barest sense, is a set of principles around how to work. I think that the better question is, why is Agile? Agile is because working had become so problematic and so bogged down in bureaucracies that actually working was becoming almost impossible.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell and Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell and Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
Hey, Jack here. Today we are going to explore business agility and what it means exactly to be agile. We will also discuss the future of work and new ways of working with Mr. Karl Smith. Karl is a co-founder of Agile World, where their mission is to support educational and training initiatives that provide free Agile training resources for everyone. Agile World is committed to practical Agile, knowing that it can have a fundamental and positive impact on individuals, communities, and businesses by aiding them in everyday life. Karl has been named in the top 100 thought leaders and influencers to follow in 2021 by Thinkers 360, and is currently ranked number one globally by Thinkers 360 as the thought leader and influencer for Agile and the future of work. He is the founder and director of the Human-Centered Design Society, which is directly involved in central government policy in the House of Commons and the House of Lords through a number of committees, including Associate Parliamentary Group for Design and Innovation. The British Computer Society has acknowledged him for his contribution to user experience as a discipline with a fellowship. The quote-unquote human element is critical to any successful organizational change effort. In this episode, we will discuss how the principles of Agile can be successfully leveraged towards new ways of working and organizational change success. Please join us as we discuss business agility, Agile, future of work, and new ways of thinking. Joining us from Edinburgh, Scotland, United Kingdom, Karl, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the welcome and for the introduction.
You bet. I'm really looking forward to this interview, Karl, and it's really an honor and a pleasure to have you join us. So thank you so much. Looking forward to sharing some of your insight with our listeners. So first, Karl, before we get started, can you introduce yourself further to our listeners?
Certainly. So the intro was very nice and helpful, pointed out some interesting facets of my career. I'm a consultant and I'm really focused on helping my clients move to the next level, to enable them to adopt new technologies and new thinking practices, to enable them to establish new ways of working, better ways of working, and to facilitate better working environments for their staff and for their teams to work together better, and for the customers to receive better outcomes from their transactions.
Interesting. So let's dive in some more here. And Karl, my first question is, and we'll include articles and links that we'll refer to throughout this discussion. We'll be sure to put those in the show notes. But you had an article, and in it, it says, quote, "Scaled organizational agility is the future of work," and is a talk and discussion with you, Karl Smith, regarding Agile transformation. So if you don't mind, I want to break that down first before we get started here in our conversation today into some of the basic blocking and tackling for our listeners. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions here. If you can just define those for us, that would be great. So when people say business agility, what does that mean? What does business agility mean exactly?
So business agility is the taking of the core concepts of Agile as it once related to software development and absorbing them into the business ways of working. Essentially, taking in the core and common cadences and behaviors, the activities and ceremonies, and also the expectation of teamwork over individuality, which is kind of quite a dramatic change for businesses who are very much driven by individual capabilities, now looking instead to establish teamwork.
So then, Karl, what is Agile?
So This is a problematic statement. What is agile? So agile, in its barest sense, is a set of principles around how to work. I think that the better question is, why is agile? Um, Agile is because working had become so problematic and so bogged down in bureaucracies that actually working was becoming almost impossible.
Yeah. Interesting. So, Karl, then the part three of this first question, what is the future of work then? How do you define quote unquote future of work, which over the last few years here seems to become more and more of it's certainly much more than a buzzword, but it's an idea and a concept that's relatively new, correct?
Not really. I mean, I think there's always been this notion of future of work. We had the Industrial Revolution, which changed the future of work from being localized in your town into being localized as a center of resources. Then we had a digital revolution that moved us outside of physicality. And now we're looking at a revolution around how people work in general. So that which is a kind of a combination of both of those.
Sure.
Where once we had to go to a place to work, now we need to be connected to places to work. And as the world has become globalized, so humans are also becoming globalized, but through digital engagements.
Sure. So then, Karl, what is, quote, new ways of working?
So new ways of working is really about fundamentally changing what work is, as well as how to do it. In a previous world, before COVID, we would have had departments and skill sets working through a very linear process, whereas now it's very much focused around how do we get to the point of value as quickly as possible. In Agile, we do that through something called value slicing, very quickly determining where the value is in the requirement for the work. And then the other piece is something called economic ordering, so that you order the work in terms of the pieces that deliver economic value quickly. So instead of a massive program lasting 3 years where you deliver something that's magnificent, that makes your business, you actually start delivering in 2 to 3 weeks or 2 to 3 months, something that shows people that your intent and your capability is to deliver the massive program, but actually now your shareholders get return on investment, your customers get a better experience, and there's a continuous improvement into that magnificent final delivery.
Yeah. So it's really taking the approach of continuous improvement over time is really the focus, with the end game being the primary objective. But along the way, you show the incremental changes.
And also the ability to adapt. I mean, the magnificent final delivery in 3 years' time that everyone thought was the thing that people wanted may not be what you get.
Yeah.
And by being incremental in producing value, you find out what customers feel about that value. Is it the value that they are looking for? And is it delivered in the way that they want to engage with it? Because actually the customer is a moving target. Yeah. So we need to think in much shorter term values for our delivery to customers and long-term values for our delivery to shareholders.
And hence that allows the organization to be more agile. That's the idea of the whole process with business agility.
Yes.
So, Karl, you had an article, and again, I'll include the link in our show notes, but it's Digital Transformation is About People is the title. So why is this idea of Agile so critical in digital transformation and large-scale organizational change, especially in the context of the people?
So again, organizations tend to focus on hardware instead of their people. They think that by buying the latest hardware kit or software kits that they make their organization better. But without actually changing the work environment for their people, all they are doing is adding layers of complexity and layers of frustration on people. By actually looking at how people work and what work they do that adds value, they can very quickly get rid of waste. They can very quickly focus in on the things that do add value and the people who are effective in their jobs. I mean, the classic scenario is that 8 to 10% of the organization is the part of the organization that delivers financial value to the organization. The rest of it gets paid for by those 8 to 10% of the people.
You had another article, Karl, that's along the same lines, and I thought this was really interesting, but it's your article titled Amateur Business Agility or Ways of Working Will Cause Business Carnage. And then in there you say, quote, business agility is slow before it gets fast, small before big, and wrong before it becomes right. What do you mean by that? Can you share that with our listeners?
Sure. So one of the key points of business agility is it's bespoke to the organization receiving that agility. If you try to lay down a template, you're likely to kill the business advantage. Now, I know business advantage as a concept is kind of not the standard thinking these days, but actually it's a differentiator. And if you try and follow a single pattern across an organization that exists in other organizations, you kill it.
Yeah.
So the essence then is slowing down to speed up, which is a fundamental agile understanding, is actually that bringing change will cause disruption. How much disruption is very much dependent on how you do it. So instead of bringing it across the whole organization overnight, you look at candidate work that you change and see what the impact of that change is. So you experiment, and the experiment in business is a terrifying concept for most business people, yet it's the only way to really understand the impact of change.
And Karl, I think that's so powerful. And you know what you just said, bringing change will cause disruption. And that's really by definition, right? I mean, to some degree, the change is going to bring disruption. And we've always put an emphasis on this idea that one of the most important things you can do is just be honest and realistic about that fact. And I think that the more that you can prepare an organization for understanding that, you know, it's not just about the end game and meeting that objective, but it's also understanding that process, as you covered in the previous question, you know, about it's an incremental agile process where you adapt as you go. But it's, you know, part of that is really understanding the reality of the process. And it is true. I mean, you take incremental steps, and sometimes you start small through those incremental steps. And then, you know, sometimes you get it wrong and you have to course correct. And in that same article, Karl, you'd mentioned that no business agility program is 100% successful. Why so? And what can you share with our listeners on that point?
So success is based in adoption, not in intent. And so organizations may want to change, but people may not want to. I've never seen one where there's been 100% everyone on the organization wants to change. We've got to understand that people have spent their entire lives building the structure around them that actually says that they're important, that they're invaluable, that actually everything they do adds value. When you go in and try to change that in order to make it more agile as an organization, there is resistance. And so business agility in its own rights actually undermines itself because it's seeking to create a level society in an unlevel organization. And actually that is problematic. So it doesn't really deliver to the full extent of what it could do because the fundamental changes. I'll give you an example. If you bring in Agile into an organization, middle management no longer needs to exist in its current format. So what happens to all those middle managers? Well, those middle managers, for the most part, become what's known as a backlog. What do they then do? Well, they don't get let go because actually they hold all of the key characteristics and capabilities of the organization. They become knowledge managers. They become people who are the go-to knowledge workers in the organization. But asking people to change their terms of reference to work in that kind of way is quite difficult. And so at the outset, you need to determine what is good enough and also where do you stop?
That's very well said, Karl. Thanks. And I'm going to borrow that quote that you just had mentioned, that success is based in adoption, not intent. I really like that. You know, in the same article, Karl, you've also mentioned, and I want to share just a quick one sentence quote with our listeners, but you stated, quote, business agility transformation contracts cannot be outcomes based in the normal ways, as the transformation is a mixture of mindsets, or I would insert there, as you just said, maybe mental frameworks and practices. Artifacts can be created, but they don't denote done. So I think that that's well said.
That's because it's evolutionary.
Yeah,
You're not trying to deliver the business agility that your competitor has. You're trying to deliver the business agility that you need to have based around your competitive advantage,
absolutely.
based around the skills and knowledge of the people that you
Yeah.
have. So it will be unique.
Yeah, absolutely. A great quote there. I really like that. And you also mentioned, I told you I like this article, so I want to ask another question. But the other point that you made is that no business agility program is ever complete. And so I'd like to ask you to share with our listeners, why is that? I mean, if you have an end game in mind and you have this goal, are you saying that you never really reach that goal, or that the objectives change? Or what can you say to our listeners about that?
So business agility is about how you work within a environment, within external pressures and working practices. They are constantly in motion.
Yeah.
And so the notion of agility being done, or done, as an agile person might say, is just ludicrous, because the purpose is to make people flexible enough to adapt to the next conflict, the next issue, the next change in market forces, rather than simply meeting the first one. And by changing organizations to be able to do that, what you're really doing is giving people the mental model to be able to be
Mhm.
adapted.
Yeah, well said. And you even state in this article again, quote, business agility transformation is both an evolution and a revolution, meaning that it keeps on going forever and adapts to enable the business to adapt. And I
Yes.
think at the end of the day, that summarizes very well our conversation so far. So, Karl, what can you say about organizational resistance in such an effort? And you briefly mentioned that, I think, a little bit in your first response. And the first question is that not everybody's always on board with the change. Obviously, it takes some internal alignment and stakeholder participation, and so you got to have the right motivations and the right knowledge within your internal organization. You got to have the right organizational mindset in general. But you always have some sort of internal, to a certain degree, organizational resistance. What can you say about that?
So this is an HR matter, is how I normally start with this part of the conversation. It's problematic that you're changing the terms of reference that people have with their work. And at an executive level, people need to understand that there will be resistance to that. I have worked on major transformations where we created a ghost office to deal with internal strife that the transformation was creating. So rather than fighting people to change, the narrative was adapted to ensure that whatever negative things were being said were disrupted by the positive language of senior executives. Now, that seems very sneaky, and in a certain extent it is, but it's also quite helpful for people to help them not destroy their own careers. There were a number of people who became flagged as potentially lethal to the organization because of their behaviors. And actually, in their own minds, they were doing the right thing. And this is the conflict in becoming more agile, is that for the last 150 years in business, people have been told not to be agile, but to deal with the problem in front of them and then deal with the next problem in front of them. Whereas agility is about dealing with every problem in front of everyone at the same time. It's concurrency rather than a linear process. And that actually is a very different way of working. I don't know if I answered your question there, because it's not an easy one to answer. Ultimately, organizations need to decide if the people who are being disruptive to transformation can be brought around to the view that it's going to help the organization, or if they need to leave. And in some cases, they are asked to leave.
In this article, Karl, you'd mentioned that you call them rebels and dissidents. And and I think sometimes that's a pretty good description. And I think that the way that I usually think about this is that to a certain degree, organizational resistance can be good, right? Because there's a lot you can
Yeah.
learn from that. And I think that the more, like you said, you look at the problem in front of you and you look at what are the attributes, why are they being resistant? Is it because there's lack of motivation for some reason? Is there a lack of knowledge just in general about the objective? Is there some sort of organizational let's call it setting or artifact that's prohibiting them from really understanding and aligning? And sometimes maybe the resistance is for a good reason. So I think it takes some time to kind of understand what's causing the resistance. But I think at some point, isn't it true that, after you give these rebels and dissidents the time that they certainly deserve and the conversations that they certainly deserve, and you give them the tools and the resources and the support to have those productive conversations, but at some point, isn't it, as you've heard, I'm sure many times, you're on the bus or you're off. At some point, is there a line where they're going to have to be off the bus?
It depends upon the client company. It's really up to them to decide what is the parameters. Certainly, one client company hired an external agency to do psych evaluations of their senior managers to see what the psychological basis and likely reaction to change would be, and also whether or not they were actually suitable to be leaders, because most people who get into leadership to advance their careers, usually from another area. And so leadership roles are not necessarily held by actual leaders. I think the reason for the ghost office, as I said, was to actually formulate strategies to deal with negativity around change, but also to work out what we were doing wrong. Because since the intent of agility is to, in a certain extent, liberate workers from being overburdened with bureaucracy in order to allow them to work better and quicker, be more engaged in a ecosystem or community of other workers, you have to wonder why people would resist that, because actually it sounds like the nirvana of work. So we've got to be a little bit introspective about what have we done that has created this scenario? Is it us or is it the person? And also, how do we sort of head it off at the pass so it doesn't become an outright revolt?
Right. And I think that there is a place to a certain degree for the, I don't know if antagonist is the right word, but, having somebody on the team that's always questioning and just maybe looking for validation in the way that the organization works and what they do and the direction that they're heading. And I think that's positive, but that's a little bit different than, someone who's, or a group of stakeholders that are always creating some sort of organizational resistance to whether it's growth or transformation or an agile environment, and that can make it very difficult to accomplish the objectives.
It does make it very difficult, but it also, maybe that person has the unique perspective on what the value system in the organization was. Do we draw that down and try and work out what key components that they have indicated that we are somehow either overruling or missing? And do we adapt accordingly? I mean, these decisions are not the transformation team's mandate. They are actually the senior executive's mandate. But we just need to present to them, this has happened, these things are happening, these are the possible responses, this is what we learned. What do you want to do with it? I mean, this is your organization. How do you want to proceed? Because we don't want to disenfranchise people because they make the organization function. But at the same time, some people could actually derail completely the transformation or, in fact, kill it, which is another common aspect of transformation. And anyone that's been through various transformation fads over the last 30 or 40 years knows how to kill one. You exhaust the money and then everyone goes away and leaves you alone.
Right. So Karl, talking about this idea of being agile and organizational change and this idea of incremental continuous improvement, but it really, you also have to be a bit objective through metrics, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you can't change what you can't measure, right? Or what you don't measure. What can you share with our listeners in terms of the value of metrics in being agile?
So I think the essential metric is flow of work. It's so easy to go back to the metrics of Henry Ford and say, we knocked out 500 cars, we're wonderful. If they're all black cars and no one's looking for a black car, it doesn't matter how many cars you knocked out because no one wants them. So I think in Agile, we're looking at what is the flow of work? How long did it take to get from an idea to a delivery? And was that delivery something that our customers wanted? So again, we have these problematic issues around technology where people are interested in release rate. Well, Who cares? I mean, you can release 10,000 releases over 3 or 4 days or a week, and they could add no value to the organization either. So I think there's a number of different kinds of metrics, and that's the essential point. There's existing metrics, what do they tell us and why? Why are we gathering them? There's transformation metrics that tell us we're moving, that we are moving from one state to another. And there may be multiple transitions and therefore multiple sets of metrics to understand that transition. And then there's actual impact metrics that tells us that we are getting better engaged with our customers. Now, normal people use NPS, Net Promoter Score, but there are other metrics as well that we can use internally to understand how it's working for staff, how it's working for vendors. And there's also this tie back to our intent was to deliver a better set of outcomes and behaviors for our customers. Did we? And that's why you tie that to the flow of work to understand what did we do with the desire? How do we break it down into packages of work and into incremental change? And did we deliver value against those initial requirements of our customers, our stakeholders, our regulators, or whoever it is?
Yeah. And Karl, I think this is often an area where a lot of organizations, and especially in an ERP organizational change project, or frankly, any organizational change project, where they have this idea of metrics, but a lot of times perhaps they're not as carefully considered as they should be. And in your article here, and again, that's Agile Metrics Are a View. You mentioned that most metrics say nothing useful. And then you go on to say that during Agile transformation activities, it's becoming more and more clear that the metrics employed are confusing, pointless, and highly frustrating. They are often a side of the desk activity that expresses nothing useful about the transformation or the optimizations in the flow of work that Agile is intended to deliver as a continuous evolution. That's a pretty important notion of the article. Can you just give us an example, or just kind of maybe drill down a little more tactically? Do you have an example that you could illustrate with our listeners around that idea?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the classic one is how many agile teams do we have? So that's an abstract metric that indicates change, except it doesn't actually indicate change. It indicates an organizational construct that doesn't necessarily deliver anything. We now have 500 Scrum Masters and 100 Agile coaches. So what? Doesn't mean anything. And this is the thing: is these are metrics. They're true metrics, but they don't actually tell me that we are now responding to our customers' complaints quicker. And as a business person and business agility, that's what I need to know. Did we resolve our top 10 business issues that come from our customers in the last 12 months? No. What did we do then?
In that example, Karl, those are metrics for sure, but they're metrics that you create at the onset of a project. And for the most part, they stay static, right? Those aren't necessarily metrics that will change throughout the duration of the project. It says, hey, they're organizational constructs to be sure. And you're just saying, hey, we have this idea that we want to do something about change. So we put these teams in place. So, hey, that's proof that we're doing something. But at the end of the day,
it's one of those problems that people say we don't have any agile teams, we don't have anyone working in an agile way.
Yeah.
So that's great, but a metric I would be interested in was how many new risks were raised when you moved to an agile way of working.
Yeah.
How many opportunities were found to change processes and behaviors now that you're working in an agile way, and what was the outcome from those? So we raised a risk around the ordering of our work because it's not value sliced, so we're still doing big chunks of work, but we're now trying to describe it in an agile way. That's pointless. But it's actually, that metric has now indicated there's a problem with how we're trying to do transformation.
Yeah, I think that's a good example from a high level that, hey, we're doing something because we created these agile teams, but so what, right? That's really not a metric. That's an intent.
Yeah, well, so why are we doing metrics? We're doing metrics to understand for the business how they're meeting their strategic and tactical goals. That's what metrics are for. And then for HR, it's about churn and understanding happiness. I know it's a fluffy metric, but it's still important, and to understand environmental engagement and those kinds of factors. In a transformation, we need to understand what our baseline is. So we get the existing metrics around all the areas we're involved in transforming, and then try and understand what is moving. And so in transformation, most of the metrics should be emergent. They should emerge from the existing baseline metrics to understand change. But in terms of the endpoint metrics, well, firstly, there is no endpoint.
Yeah.
But what we can do is start to say, in the flow of work, we now see that where we once had a regulatory requirement came in and we were able to respond within 3 years, we can now respond in 3 months.
Yeah.
And that is powerful.
Very powerful. Yeah, for sure. Karl, this whole conversation really around business agility and being agile is this idea of continuous improvement, right? It's course corrections on an incremental basis that at the end of the day, that's the process that gets you to where you want to be. And you have a article where you talk about fail fast, fail small to avoid failing big and failing slow. And I just think that's well said. And again, it was a good read, and it mentioned some great points and some great ideas. But why is that? What can you share with our listeners on that point? This idea of just let's fail fast, let's fail small, let's fail frequently. But at the end of the day, that's going to avoid some failing big and failing slow is organizational torture.
Okay, so when America decides to send a man to the moon, they didn't go out and just build a rocket. They went out and did a bunch of experiments to find out what a rocket should be. And then from those experiments, they built a rocket. Now, this is how you build things. You don't go out and just do it and hope it works. You go out and do incremental testing and experimentation on smaller things, smaller components to make sure it works before you try and put them together. And then you test the components you put together to ensure that as a set of components, they work together before you build it onto bigger and bigger blocks. Now, it's the same is true with Agile. One of my favorite sayings is, I don't want to launch out into the deep. I want to launch out into the shallows.
Yeah.
Because if I launch out into the deep, laden in my craft with a strong determination to deliver and then sink, I'm going down with my ship. and I'm probably going to take my client company with me.
Yeah.
And that's quite a dramatic change. We need to facilitate small failures. And people are horrified with the idea of failure. The actual word failure is kind of in business world is kind of like bad numbers in China. You can't use the word failure. Yet failure is really, really important.
Yeah.
And I think failure for Agile really comes more from this experimental thinking behavior,
Mm-hmm.
which is not a standard business practice. The last, 150 years of business practice show us that we actually are drawn towards leaders who have very strong personalities, who have this real vision and this drive, and they make the reality happen around them, which is wonderful. It's also extraordinarily dangerous and a way to waste utterly billions of dollars on achieving something that should have cost millions.
Yeah. Interesting. And that actually in the same article, Karl, you'd mentioned that from my experience, I've never seen Agile actually fail. I've seen people pervert its meaning and make up their own versions, then blame a framework for personal incompetence. But failure is good, right? And I think that with any organizational change effort, especially in the context of business agility and this idea of Agile, almost by definition, failure is a good thing, right? That's really part of the idea of Agile, is being able to course correct, allowing mistakes, but do it in a very controlled, mechanized manner. And it's a good thing.
And those experiments are not like, off you go, here's $10,000, try and find something out. No, they're set up with the intent to discover something. So although you are allowed to meander within those constraints, it's like, here's 2 weeks, go away and see how far you can get.
Yeah.
And within that, report every day in a stand-up. Explain the impediments and the risks and issues. Agile transformation should be done in an agile way.
Yeah.
And conform to all the constraints and opportunity structures around Agile. And once you're working in that way, then you very quickly know whether or not you're going the right direction. And if you find out after 2 days that what's been asked is impossible or would actually cost so much more money than you've been allocated, you simply say, let's stop. That's the other power in Agile that most people are not really aware of, is the capacity to stop work and reallocate resources to things that will actually add value.
Yeah. And, I think that a lot of organizations, there's been a lot of research on this topic, that organizations that are really embedded in their culture, they allow innovation and creativity, and hence, really by definition, they allow failure and course correction, and they allow this idea of failing fast and failing small and failing often is actually a productive thing. It's an organizational culture mindset that is extremely valuable.
I think there's some much misunderstood things about failing. According to some pictures I've seen of Steve Jobs, when he first set up, he used to have a pirate flag behind him rather than an apple. And there's a book that I read, Pirates in the Navy. Our corporate structures have now become the Navy. They are the guardians of control, yet they're looking for the capability to think in an abstract way and deliver multiple different values from one core capability. That's a different rationale set of thinking than applying a standard behavior across the whole organization.
Yeah, sure.
And you need to build that in, and you need to think like a pirate in the Navy.
That's interesting. Karl, and I wanted to ask you about this question and this idea of Agile becoming fragile. And you mentioned in an article that when Agile becomes fragile, nobody wins. Please share with our listeners what you mean by this. And I really think this is an important and interesting notion. But can you elaborate on that idea?
So the joy of Agile is its capability to empower people. But by empowering people, some people will take that as an opportunity to gain greater control. Gain greater control over their environment and over the environments of other people. And actually, by driving Agile in organizations with very strong people in it, there is the risk that some people will destabilize the Agile and bring in a bunch of anti-patterns that will allow them to take control. And I have actually seen it. Massive financial organizations where someone's taken over 7 or 8 departments and become an uber boss. And it was amazing, but they destabilized Agile to such an extent that the anti-patterns became the norm.
So can you just drill down just a little bit more? Let's peel that onion back just a little bit further. But exactly, just help me understand, though, specifically, and I understand what you just said, and that was great insight. But exactly how does, within an organizational context, does this idea of Agile become fragile? What drives that? What are some of the internal organizational, attributes can actually make this project too fragile?
So I think there's a sense that we know what Agile is, that we own Agile. So one of the other characteristics that I come across quite a lot is we don't need to do that. We already own Agile in this organization. And you're going, what does that mean? What does that look like? And they show you, look, we have stand-ups. And I'm going, okay, what do you do with what you learn from those stand-ups? Oh, nothing. We just share with each other. So that's not Agile.
Yeah.
I often describe people that have stand-ups with no connectivity between other activities in Agile as just people declaring they have no chairs. And so, there is a bunch of things that you do, practices and behaviors within Agile that actually all work together. I actually talked to someone online recently about it, and they were saying, Agile's not really a thing. And I'm going, well, it kind of is, but it's not what people think it is. It's not a single practice in a single location. It's a very, very disparate set of practices that all join together into a very complex mosaic. And there are different levels of knowledge within that agility, but is all drawn from team behaviors. And that's kind of unusual in business practices.
So, Karl, for Agile to become fragile, isn't it really just poor definition and understanding of what Agile really is then? Is that what it is? Is just there's not really alignment on what the fundamental approach of Agile is? and what that process looks
I,
like?
I, I think it's picking and choosing the bits that you want to do.
I see.
It's someone says to you, "I'm going to sell you a car. It's only got one wheel because that's what I want you to have." You kind of going to say no thanks. Yet for some reason,
Yeah.
in Agile, people go, "Yeah, well, we've done these three things, but we're not doing any of the rest of that because it doesn't make sense to us." You're going, "Well, you kind of said that you've just got a one wheel car there." And you think that it's going to be stable and going to get you where you want to, and the answer is it won't.
Yeah.
What you'll do is you'll feel for a while that you're doing agile, but you don't actually get any of the benefits of it.
Yeah. Makes sense. So, Karl, tell me about one idea that I'm a fan of is this idea of servant leadership, especially in the context of large scale organizational change. And you had mentioned in another article, and Karl, I told you I'm a fan of some of your work in your article. So I'm going to be sure to
Wow.
list these. I really like, you make some great insights, and I really looking forward to sharing this with our listeners. But you had mentioned that, quote, servant leadership is not just another fad in business, it's a critical component of successful adoption of business agility. Can you tell us more about the value of servant leadership, maybe what it is in the context of successful business agility outcomes?
Yes. So one of the fundamental behaviors in agility is an inversion of the pyramid,
Mm-hmm.
where once you climbed over your fellows to get to the top of the pyramid, now the further up you are, the more people you have on your shoulders who need help. And that is a very strange experience. And it happened to me as an EVP that I had been the boss of hundreds of people, and then I became their servant. And it was a bit of a shock to me mentally, because actually the change from telling people what to do, or at least guiding them to reach my targets and goals, to becoming essentially a fountain of knowledge and a supportive figure was dramatic.
Mm.
Yet it's fundamental to creating the environment where, one, the staff who have a lower level in the organization see that everyone is being impacted by Agile, and it's not just something that is being shoved onto them to make them work harder as a kind of a stick, but actually is providing them with the environment that allows them to deliver their work better.
Mm.
And some of the things that I did, instead of me getting my list of priorities from the exec, I turned that into a strategic backlog
Mm.
of things that were coming down that anyone that was working in my division could read.
Sure.
I mean, can you imagine a corporate structure that allows a recent graduate to see the strategic aims of the division they're working in?
Yeah, right.
Yet that was what I did, because it created a buzz, for one thing, but it also created this sense that I can do more than what I was brought in to do. I actually had some people, I had to stop them from working on everything. They were so excited to have access to the reasons behind the work that actually they want to, and what I did was I instituted a way of working that said, you choose what you want to work on, you draw down from the backlog, you create the work teams to do the work, but one of you must nominate themselves as the accountable person, because I need to know who is going to report the current status of the work. And
Yeah.
that is a fundamentally different way of working. But it was astonishing. I mean, some people were trying to work 200%. I mean, they were trying to work all night and all weekend, because
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
normally they would do one piece of work before the servant leadership engagement, and then they were now doing 6 pieces of work.
Yeah.
And my role was to come in and to support and to explain deeper levels of the complexity around the work. So when someone said, "Oh, we're doing this for so and so, what does this mean?" I could explain the previous engagements with that client, or the work that had been done, or the current business status that they're in, and why they're looking to do this. And often the work would be challenged.
Yeah.
Surely this is not the answer for them. Have we considered this, this, and this? And then you go back through all the pre-sales and you talk about what was offered and what they decided to do. And from that, you get a much better response for your clients. And that's really the end point, isn't it? You are making work serve the end customers.
Well said. Well said. And really, in a way, I think that at least some of the primary attributes of servant leadership, I would say, are, it's heavily focused on empathy, focusing on encouragement and supporting engagement.
And not being afraid yourself. I think that's the other thing is there's a lot of fear from senior leadership about servant leadership that somehow it undermines their status. And actually what it does, it almost elevates you to godlike status because you're now treated as the honorable owner of knowledge.
Yeah, right. You're seen more as being human, right? I mean, it's just empathy and just makes you more human, more relatable. Really interesting. Thanks for that. So, Karl, thank you so much for your time today. And before we leave, I have one more question for you, but this has been a fun conversation and looking forward to having you on again soon. I think that there's so much more to talk about here, but I hope we were able to share some of the key points and ideas and notions with our listeners in terms of Agile, creating and supporting an Agile business environment. Before I let you go today, Karl, as fellow practitioners, I feel that we absolutely benefit from learning from our colleagues and our friends, and of course, both boots on the ground as well as researchers. But how would you summarize this conversation? If you had to distill your work into 3 or 4 sentences, what would you say to our listeners as the last little nugget of insight?
So I'd probably bring it down to Agile is about challenging yourself to be a continuous learner. And by being a continuous learner, you don't assume that you have anyone's answer. You investigate and you experiment to find out what the environment would be for other people to find their answers themselves.
Well said. Karl, thank you so much for your time today. And for our listeners, please be sure to check out karlsmith.info. Is there anything you want to share with our listeners in terms of the best way to reach out to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on LinkedIn every day. I joined in 2007, so some of it's probably my fault. But yeah, I'm very engaged with LinkedIn, and I run several large groups on it. And I'm also involved with something called Agile World. So if there's people out there who want to volunteer, get involved. This is the charity, the 501c3 charity based in California, focused on creating agile media and education through entertainment, which is, if you think about it, when you're a child, things that made you laugh, you always remembered.
Yeah.
So that's ongoing. But just contact me, and I want to chat to people and find out what I don't know, which is actually a huge amount of stuff.
Well, that's super. Thanks, Karl. And we'll be sure to share all that in our show notes as well for our listeners. Karl, thank you again. Be well. We really appreciate your time and your insight, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks a lot.
You bet. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges. We discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change by drawing on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. We are incredibly grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us in our podcast as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community and contribute to its success by bringing research and practice closer together. We want to make sure this is the most useful and insightful ERP podcast you listen to, and we'd love your help in doing so by leaving us feedback and a review. A great place to do so is at Apple Podcasts. Just click on the Listen in Apple Podcasts link, then click Ratings and Reviews, and let us know your thoughts. You can get more info about the show, including show notes and episode highlights for this and all of our episodes, by visiting NestellAssociates.com and clicking the podcast option. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. And don't forget to follow us on social media, #TheERPOCJ. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic week.